She crossed half a continent to marry a man who didn't want her, then found out two more didn't either. By sundown on her very first day in Caldwell Crossing, Elena Ashcroft stood in the middle of a dirt street with an empty coin purse, a battered suitcase, and a town full of strangers laughing behind their hands at the woman nobody chose. She had nothing left to go back to, nothing left to go forward with. Just the dust, the heat, and a choice that would define everything she'd ever become. Stay and fight, or disappear forever. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, stay with me until the end of this story. Drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach hit a rut 3 miles outside of Caldwell Crossing and threw Elena Ashcroft hard against the wooden doorframe, bruising her shoulder badly enough that she had to bite down on her lip to keep from crying out. The two other passengers, a heavy-set merchant who smelled of tobacco and a young man sleeping with his hat over his face, didn't stir. She pressed her palm against the sore spot and looked out the scratched window at the Kansas plain spreading out in every direction, flat and enormous and indifferent. It was August of 1879. The heat came off the ground, invisible waves. She told herself the shoulder didn't matter. She'd been telling herself variations of that same thing for 7 weeks, since the morning she locked the door of her rented room in Baltimore, handed the key to the landlady, and climbed aboard the first of what would become an exhausting chain of rail cars and stage lines heading west. 7 weeks of telling herself the thing she was feeling wasn't fear, that the hollowness in her chest was just hunger, just exhaustion, just the particular loneliness of traveling alone. She was 26 years old. She had $43 folded inside her left boot, a suitcase containing 2 dresses, a wool coat too heavy for the season, a small wooden box of her mother's letters tied with kitchen twine, and a contract. The contract was the important thing. 3 pages of careful handwriting, signed by a marriage broker in Cincinnati named Mr. Beaumont Hale, who had placed advertisements in Eastern newspapers on behalf of frontiermen seeking capable wives. Elena had answered 3 of those advertisements last spring, never expecting more than one to respond. All 3 had written back. She'd read those letters so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Caldwell Crossing appeared first as a water tower, then a church steeple, then a scatter of wooden storefronts arranged along a main street that wasn't paved with anything except packed earth. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of a building that said General Store across its face in faded paint, and the driver called down that this was it, end of the line, everybody out. Elena climbed down with her suitcase and stood in the street and looked around. It was a Wednesday afternoon. A few horses were tied at a post outside the saloon. 2 women in aprons stood talking outside what looked like a seamstress's shop, and they both stopped and looked at her in that particular way that told her they already knew who she was. Word traveled fast in small places. Mr. Hale had sent ahead. She straightened her back, picked up her suitcase, and went to find the first name on her list. His name was Arthur Pruitt, and Mr. Hale's file described him as a 34-year-old farmer with 80 acres of wheat land, a 2-room house, and a steady, if modest, income. His letter to Elena had been formal and a little stiff, but not unkind. He'd written that he needed a woman who wasn't afraid of hard work, that he didn't have much use for decoration, and that he hoped she was practical. She'd written back that practical was exactly what she was. She found the farm 2 miles from the edge of town, down a dirt track that ran between fields of wheat that were chest-high and nearly ready for harvest. The farmhouse was small and unpainted, with a kitchen garden on one side that had gone mostly to weeds. A dog barked from under the porch steps. She knocked on the door. A woman answered. She was maybe 30, with dark hair and a square face, and the particular look of someone who has been braced for something unpleasant. She held a dish towel in both hands and twisted it once without seeming to notice she was doing it. "I'm looking for Arthur Pruitt," Elena said. "My name is Elena Ashcroft. I've come from Baltimore, Mr. Hale's agency. I know who you are." The woman's jaw tightened. "Arthur isn't here." "Can you tell me when he'll be back? He's expecting—" "He married me," the woman said. 3 weeks ago, at the Methodist Church in Hays City. My name is Mrs. Pruitt now." Elena stood very still. "I don't know what he told Mr. Hale's agency," the woman continued, and her voice had something in it that wasn't quite apology, but wasn't quite hostility either. Just the flat exhaustion of someone delivering bad news they'd been dreading. But whatever he wrote, it was before he asked me. I'm sorry you came all this way. Elena opened her mouth, closed it. She looked past the woman into the dim interior of the house. A table set for two. A checked curtain over the window, a coat hanging by the door that was too large to be the woman's. I see, she said finally. He should have written Hale's office. He should have done a lot of things. A pause. I'm sorry, she said again, and this time it sounded more like she meant it. Elena picked up her suitcase and walked back down the dirt track to the road. She didn't let herself think about it until she was out of sight of the farmhouse. Then she stopped in the middle of the road and stood there for a moment with the wheat on both sides of her and the sky enormous overhead. And she did some arithmetic. She had come from Baltimore. She had $43. She had no job, no family left to speak of, no room to return to. She had two more names. She walked back to town. Oh, the second name was Thomas Calloway, and Mr. Hale's notes said he was 41, a cattle buyer with a house on the north end of Caldwell Crossing, and a 10-year-old daughter from his first marriage whose mother had died of a fever. His letter to Elena had been warmer than Prewitt's. More words, more detail, a quality in the writing that suggested he was genuinely trying to give her an honest picture of what she'd be walking into. He'd mentioned his daughter by name. Clara. He'd said Clara was quiet and needed patience, and that he hoped Elena wouldn't mind a child who took time to warm up to strangers. She'd liked that letter. She found the house without difficulty. Anyone she asked in town knew Thomas Calloway. The house was better than she'd expected, 2 stories with a proper porch and a kitchen garden that was actually tended. She knocked. A girl answered the door, serious-faced and watching Elena with careful eyes. You must be Clara, Elena said. She tried a smile. The girl looked at her for a moment. Papa's inside, she said, and stepped back to let Elena through. Thomas Calloway was in the front room, standing with his back to the window and his hands jammed in his coat pockets, and the expression of a man facing a firing squad. He was tall and fair-haired and would have been handsome except for the tension in his face. He looked at Elena and swallowed. Miss Ashcroft, he said. Mr. Calloway. She set her suitcase down. I've just come from the Prewitt farm. I wanted to let you know in case you thought I'd... I know about Prewitt, he said. News travels. Sit down, please. She sat. Clara had disappeared somewhere into the back of the house. Thomas Calloway remained standing, which told her something was coming that he hadn't figured out how to start. I want to be straight with you, he said, because you deserve that much. You've come a long way. I have. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor, then out the window, then back at her. My mother arrived 2 days ago from St. Louis. I wasn't expecting her. She came without writing, and she has. He stopped, started again. My family has certain ideas about what's proper, about who I ought to marry. My mother specifically. She made it very clear that she would not allow... He pressed his lips together. I'm sorry, that's a cowardly way to put it. What I mean is that I allowed her to persuade me. I don't have a better way to say it than that. Elena looked at him. He was genuinely ashamed. She could see that. It didn't make it better. She doesn't want a mail-order bride, Elena said. Not a question. She doesn't want one from the East, he said. She has someone in mind, a girl from a family she knows in St. Louis. It's... He stopped again. I'm sorry, he said. I know that doesn't help you. No, Elena said. It doesn't. She picked up her suitcase. Clara appeared in the doorway of the back hall. She must have been listening. And looked at Elena with an expression that was hard to read. Not unkind, just watchful. Goodbye, Clara, Elena said. The girl said nothing, but she watched Elena all the way to the door. She did not allow herself to cry on the walk back to the main street. She was aware of being watched. She'd been watched since she stepped off the stagecoach, and the story of the Prewitt farm had clearly made the rounds already because she could see it in the way people stopped their conversations when she passed, the way eyes slid away and then came back. Small towns had their own kind of cruelty, which wasn't always intentional, but was thorough. The third name was a man called Douglas Webb, a 37-year-old sawmill owner with land outside town. His letter had been the briefest of the 3. 4 sentences, not unfriendly, but nothing you'd call warm. He'd mentioned that he needed someone capable and that he was willing to offer a fair arrangement. She hadn't liked the letter much, but she'd kept it. She asked at the general store for directions to Webb's mill and was given them by a woman behind the counter who had the careful expression of someone trying not to show that she already knew everything. She walked the 1.5 miles to the mill in the August heat. The mill was silent when she arrived. No sound of saws, no workers visible. The door to the main building was padlocked. A hand-lettered sign was nailed to the post beside it. She had to lean close to read it in the afternoon light. Gone to Dodge City for the season, back in October. D. Webb. She stood in front of that sign for a long time. She didn't know how long exactly. Long enough that the shadows shifted. A crow landed on the roof of the mill and looked at her and flew away again. Douglas Webb had left town before she arrived. Whether he'd known she was coming, whether he'd left because he knew, she couldn't say. It didn't matter. The result was the same. She walked back to Caldwell Crossing. It was past 4 o'clock when she came back down the main street for what felt like the 100th time that day, though she'd only arrived that morning. The sun was lower and the heat had eased a fraction, and she was thirsty and her feet hurt, and she had a bruised shoulder and $43 and nowhere to sleep tonight. She stopped in front of the general store and tried to think. Behind her, she heard a woman say, not quietly enough, "That's her. The one Hale sent. 3 of them, and not one of them would have her." A man's voice, lower. "Can you blame them?" She didn't turn around. She went into the general store and bought a piece of bread and a cup of water from the barrel they kept beside the door, and she stood at the window and ate the bread and drank the water and looked out at the street and thought about Baltimore. She thought about the room she'd had there, above the bookbinder's shop, with the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a running horse. She thought about her mother, who had been dead 3 years. She thought about her brother Henry, who had his own family now and no particular room in it for her. She thought about the dress shop where she'd worked, where the owner had died in February and his widow had sold the shop and put Elena and 2 other women out of work on the same afternoon. She'd answered Hale's advertisements in March. She'd told herself it was a practical decision. She'd told herself it wasn't desperation. Standing in the general store in Caldwell Crossing, Kansas, with breadcrumbs on her fingers and a bruised shoulder and the sound of people laughing softly outside, she admitted to herself that it had been desperation. And now she was here, and she had nothing. Not nothing left, but nothing, period. The woman behind the counter was watching her with an expression that had some pity in it, and she hated the pity more than the laughing. "Is there somewhere in town a person could take a room for a few nights?" Elena asked. She kept her voice level. She was proud of that. "Mrs. Hatch takes in boarders," the woman said. "Down the street. Blue house." "Thank you." She counted her money in the back of her mind. A room would cost her, depending on Mrs. Hatch's rates. Food would cost her. She needed to think clearly. She needed to not cry in the middle of the general store. She went out. Mrs. Hatch was a narrow woman in her 60s who lived in a blue house that was substantially less blue than it must have once been, the paint gone chalky and peeling at the corners. She looked at Elena for a long moment at the door, taking in the suitcase, the hat with the wilted ribbon, the dust on Elena's shoes, and said she had a room at the back, $1 a week, meals included, but dinner only. "That's fine," Elena said. "Thank you." The room was small and clean. There was a window that looked out on the backyard where Mrs. Hatch kept chickens, and a narrow bed with a quilt on it, and a hook on the wall for clothes. Elena set her suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands in her lap and sat there. She was tired in a way that wasn't just her body. She thought about the look on the face of Arthur Pruitt's wife. That particular look of a woman apologizing for something that wasn't her fault, but was connected to her in a way she couldn't escape. She thought about Thomas Calloway standing with his hands in his pockets, looking ashamed and not ashamed enough to do anything differently. She thought about Douglas Webb's sign nailed to a post, "Gone to Dodge City for the season." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and held them there. She had not cried yet, and she was not going to cry yet. She needed to think. What she had, $42 now, after the bread and the room deposit, 2 dresses and a wool coat, her mother's letters, knowledge that she was a good bookkeeper. She'd done accounts for the dress shop for 3 years. Knowledge that she could cook, clean, organize, manage. A body that was tired but not broken. A mind that was, despite everything, still working. What she did not have: a husband, a home, a plan, anyone in this town who would help her, or any particular reason to believe tomorrow would look different. She took her hands away from her eyes. What would you do, she asked herself, if there was nothing left to lose? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But the question felt like the right one. She went to the window and looked out at the chickens moving through the backyard in the late afternoon light, pecking at the dry ground with the patient, mechanical persistence of creatures that don't think about yesterday or tomorrow and are simply here. But she ate dinner at Mrs. Hatch's table alone. Mrs. Hatch brought her a plate of beans and cornbread and then went back to whatever she'd been doing in the front room, which Elena appreciated. She didn't want to talk. She ate slowly and looked at the wall and let herself think through her situation with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to columns of numbers. She could not go back to Baltimore. That wasn't sentiment. That was arithmetic. The stage and rail fare had eaten most of her savings before she left. What remained wouldn't get her back east, and back east there was nothing waiting for her anyway. She could try to find work in Caldwell Crossing. As what? A seamstress, maybe. A cook. Some kind of domestic position. She had no particular fear of work, but she knew enough about frontier towns to know that positions for single women were scarce and poorly paid, and that she'd be looking at years before she'd saved enough to do anything more than rent a room in someone else's house. That wasn't nothing, but it wasn't anything either. She thought about Mr. Hale's contract, folded in her suitcase. The contract had an arbitration clause. If the arrangement failed through no fault of the applicant, Hale's agency was supposed to assist with alternate placements. She had no particular confidence in that clause. Men who wrote contracts like that generally did so to make themselves feel better, not to actually fulfill the terms. But she'd write to Hale in the morning regardless. And then, because she was honest with herself, whatever her other failings, she asked herself the harder question. Was there anyone else? She'd been thinking about this since she walked back from the mill. There was a part of her that had been thinking about it since she walked back from Thomas Calloway's house. A name that had come up twice in the conversation she'd overheard at the general store, and once more directly from the woman who'd mocked her in the street, though not in a way that was meant as a suggestion. Holloway, the rancher out on Carpenter Creek. He's got 2 children and a place that's going to seed since his wife died. Can't find a woman who'll go out there. Too far from town, too hard a life. The woman who'd said it had been talking to someone else, not to Elena. She hadn't meant for Elena to hear. She'd been talking about Holloway the way people in small towns talk about difficult situations, with a kind of mixed pity and relief that the difficulty belonged to someone else. Elena had been standing close enough to hear everything. She thought about what she'd heard: 2 children, a ranch going under, a man who'd lost his wife and hadn't found his footing since, a place too far from town, too hard a life. In Baltimore, 3 years ago, she would have looked at a situation like that and felt sorry for the family involved and moved on to thinking about something else. Here, now, with $42 and a bruised shoulder and a quilt that smelled of someone else's house, she looked at that situation and thought, that might be an opening. She told herself not to think too fast. She told herself to sleep on it. She told herself that going to a stranger's ranch to ask if he'd marry her would be an act of such enormous desperation that she couldn't quite let herself look directly at it yet. She lay down on the narrow bed in her clothes and stared at the ceiling. She was awake for a long time. In the morning, she washed her face at the basin in the corner of the room and changed into her better dress and ate the breakfast Mrs. Hatch left on the table, fried eggs, coffee, bread, and then sat with the coffee cooling in her cup and looked at the surface of the table and made a decision. She was not going to spend her $42 on a room and meals until they ran out and then be destitute in a town that already thought of her as an object of pity. She was not going to wait for Mr. Hale's agency to maybe possibly find her an alternate placement that may or may not materialize. She was not going to go back to Baltimore because there was nothing in Baltimore. She was going to find out where Gideon Holloway's ranch was. She was going to go there. She was going to make a case. Whether he listened or not was his business. But she was done waiting to see what other people decided to do with her situation. She finished the coffee, rinsed the cup at the basin, put on her hat, and went out. She got more information than she expected by simply asking at the feed store. The man behind the counter, a weathered fellow with a beard and no apparent malice, told her that the Holloway place was 12 miles out on the Carpenter Creek Road, that Gideon Holloway had about 300 head of cattle and land enough to run more if he had the hands for it, and that he'd been managing on his own for going on 8 months since his wife passed. His wife, Elena said. What happened to her? Fever, the man said. Same one that went through here last winter, took 4 people from the valley. He paused. Bad time for him. He's got 2 children. Boy about 12, girl maybe 7 or 8. Boy helps where he can. Girl's taking it hard. I see. She kept her voice even. Is he in town regularly? Not especially. Comes in maybe twice a month for supplies. He was in last week. A pause. She could see the man thinking something, weighing whether to say it. You're the woman Hale's agency sent, he said. Not unkind, just direct. I am. He looked at her for a moment. You thinking about Holloway? I'm thinking about my options, she said. He was quiet. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a sheet of paper and sketched her a rough map. The Carpenter Creek Road, a fork past the old Deller farm, a rise that marked the edge of the Holloway property. It's not an easy road, he said, not on foot. Is there someone with a wagon going that direction today? He thought about it. Ned Purvis runs supplies out to the ranches east of the creek on Thursdays. He might take you for $1. Where do I find Ned Purvis? He pointed. She thanked him and went. Ned Purvis was 60 years old and had the look of a man who had heard everything and was surprised by nothing. He accepted her $1 without comment, told her to be ready at 7, and when 7 came, he had his wagon loaded and waiting without any fuss. He didn't ask her what her business was. He drove in comfortable silence for the first 5 miles, and Elena sat on the wagon bench beside him and watched the Kansas plain open up around them and thought about what she was going to say. She still didn't have the right words. She knew what she wanted to convey, that she was capable, not hopeless, that she was offering something real, not just asking for charity, that she understood what she'd be walking into and wasn't pretending otherwise. She knew she needed to be direct without being hard and honest without being desperate, even though she was, in fact, desperate, and Gideon Holloway would probably be able to see that the moment she opened her mouth. Well, there were things you couldn't hide. You could only choose which true things you led with. Around the 9th mile, Ned Purvis said without preamble, Holloway's a decent man, hard since his wife, but decent underneath. Elena looked at him. He was looking at the road. He's stubborn, Ned continued as though he was making a list. Doesn't ask for help easy, loves those children. Doesn't always know how to show it. He paused. His boy Cal, he's the difficult one. Takes after his father in the stubbornness. The girl Maggie, she's quiet. Hasn't talked much since her mother went. Thank you, Elena said. For telling me. Didn't say it for thanks. Another pause. Just figured you'd rather know before you got there. The wagon went on. The Holloway property appeared gradually. First a fence line, then a scatter of cattle moving through dry grass, then a pair of outbuildings, and finally the house itself sitting on a low rise above the creek. It was larger than she'd expected. It had been a substantial house once. She could see the bones of it, the good proportions, the care that had gone into the original construction. But the years and the 8 months since his wife had taken a visible toll. The porch railing was broken in 2 places. The kitchen garden was a ruin of dead plants. One of the shutters on an upstairs window was hanging at an angle. The yard between the house and the barn had the specific look of a place where work had stopped and hadn't started again. Ned Purvis stopped the wagon at the front of the house and sat with the reins loose in his hands. Elena climbed down. She stood in the yard for a moment. A dog appeared from around the corner of the house. Not barking, just watching. Somewhere behind the barn she could hear the sound of someone working with metal, a rhythmic clanging. She walked toward the sound. She found him at the forge, a man in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair gone gray at the temples, and the particular set of jaw that comes from people who have gotten used to holding their face against something. He was working on what looked like a fence bracket, and he didn't see her at first. She stopped a few feet away and said, "Mr. Holloway." He looked up. His eyes were dark and they landed on her with the blunt, assessing quality of a man who had learned not to waste energy on polite delays. He took her in. All of her. The dress, the hat, the suitcase she was still carrying in one hand, the fact that she'd arrived with Ned Purvis, and said nothing for a moment. "You're Hale's woman," he said. "I was Hale's woman," she said. "I'm nobody's woman at the moment. That's the problem." He set down the bracket. He wiped his hands on a cloth tucked into his belt and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not hostility, but not warmth either. Caution, mostly. "I heard about the Prewitt business," he said, "and Calloway, and Webb." "Then you know why I'm here." "I know what happened," he said. "I don't know why you're here specifically." "I need a practical arrangement," she said. "And from what I've been told, you might need one too." He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Heard that from who?" he said. "Does it matter?" "It might." She put her suitcase down, just set it in the dirt, because it was heavy and she was tired of carrying it and she was done with pretending she wasn't both of those things. "I'm not going to tell you I'm here because I've decided you're the right man for me," she said. "I don't know you. You don't know me. I'm going to tell you that I've got $42 and no home and no prospects. And I'm not willing to spend what's left of my money waiting in a boarding house for something to happen. I'm offering to work, to help run this place, to care for your children, in exchange for the arrangement we'd both be entering in honest terms." He was quiet. Behind her, she could hear Ned Purvis's wagon moving down the road. He'd had other deliveries to make. "I've got enough trouble without adding a woman who doesn't know the frontier," Holloway said. "I learn fast," she said. "You don't know what you're walking into." "Then tell me." He looked at her. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at her for a long moment with that unreadable expression, and then he looked out toward the barn and the cattle beyond and the broken line of the house against the sky. "It's hard," he said. "It was hard before my wife died. It's harder now." "I know hard," Elena said. "My boy doesn't want anyone here." "I'll manage. My daughter—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that was more than caution. "Maggie doesn't talk much anymore. Since her mother, she needs patience." "I have patience," Elena said, and then, because honesty seemed to be what this conversation required, added, "I have more patience than most things. It's about the only advantage I've got right now." Another silence. A long one. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at the suitcase sitting in the dirt between them. "I'm not promising anything," he said. "I'm not making any arrangements today. I'll show you the house. You can see what you're actually looking at." "That's fair," Elena said. He looked at her once more, briefly, with that same assessing quality, and then he walked past her toward the house, and she picked up her suitcase and followed him. She didn't know, walking across that dusty yard with the dog trailing behind her, and the cattle moving in the distance, and the broken shutter knocking quietly against the upstairs window, whether this was going to work. She didn't know if Gideon Holloway would say yes, didn't know if his children would tolerate her, didn't know if she had anything real to offer, or if she was just a tired woman who'd run out of options trying to talk herself into something because the alternative was worse. What she knew was this: she was still moving. That had to count for something. The porch steps creaked under her feet as she followed him up to the door, and the door swung open into the dim interior of the house, smelling of old smoke and unwashed dishes, and the particular staleness of a home where grief had settled in and made itself comfortable. She stepped inside. She looked around at the kitchen, the piled dishes, the dead plant on the windowsill, the curtain that had come half off its rod, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. She looked at the table with one chair pushed back at an angle, as though someone had stood up quickly and never came back to straighten it. She looked at all of it. She set her suitcase down at her feet. A boy appeared in the doorway of the back hall, 12 years old, dark-haired like his father, with that same set of jaw and a look in his eyes that was pure hostility, undisguised and direct. He looked at Elena the way you look at something you didn't ask for and don't want. "Who's she?" he said to his father. Gideon Holloway looked at his son, then at Elena, then back at his son. "Cal," he said, "mind yourself." "I asked who she is." "My name is Elena Ashcroft," Elena said, before Gideon could answer. She met the boy's eyes directly. "I came to see if I could be useful to your family." Cal Holloway looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. We don't need anyone, he said. Cal. Gideon's voice sharpened. It's all right, Elena said. To Gideon, not to Cal. He doesn't have to want me here. That's honest. She looked at the boy again. I'm not asking you to want me here. I'm just here for now. Cal said nothing. He disappeared back down the hall. Elena looked around the kitchen again. $42. No home. No plan beyond this moment. She looked at the curtain hanging off its rod and thought, that's the first thing. She reached up and straightened the curtain back onto its rod. It wasn't much. It was practically nothing. But she needed to start somewhere, and that was what was in front of her, so that was what she did. Gideon Holloway didn't say yes that first afternoon. He showed her through the house with the efficiency of a man who had learned to move through his own home like a stranger, pointing out the rooms without explanation, opening doors and closing them again, not quite looking at her as he did it. She followed and kept quiet and paid attention. The downstairs was one large common room that served as kitchen and dining and sitting space, with a stone fireplace taking up most of the north wall. Off that was a small room with a desk and a broken chair and papers scattered across every surface. Ranch accounts she could see from a glance, not well organized. Off the kitchen was a narrow pantry. Upstairs there were 3 rooms, 2 bedrooms for the children and the larger one at the end of the hall where Gideon slept. There was an attic space that had been used for storage and wasn't anymore, or rather, things had been put up there and not organized, just pushed through the hatch. She noticed everything. She didn't comment on any of it. When they came back downstairs, Gideon stood in the middle of the kitchen with his arms crossed and said, "It's not what you were expecting." "I wasn't expecting anything specific," she said. "I didn't let myself." He looked at her. Smart. Practical. He was quiet for a moment. Through the window she could see Cal in the yard, doing something with a length of rope, his back deliberately turned toward the house. "I need to be straight with you," Gideon said. "Like I said, I'm not making any arrangements today." "I understand. But," he stopped, seemed to be choosing his next words with some care. "You can stay tonight. Take the attic if you don't mind the slope of the ceiling. We'll talk more in the morning." "That's fair," she said. "I'm not promising anything," he said again. "You mentioned that." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a loosening around the eyes. It was gone before she could be certain it had been there. "Dinner's at 6, he said. "Cal cooks. Fair warning." Cal's cooking turned out to be beans boiled until they were soft enough to eat without argument, cornbread that was more crust than bread, and coffee that had been on the fire long enough to taste like it was angry about something. Elena ate without complaint. She sat at the far end of the table and said nothing much, just ate and watched the family arrange themselves around the meal. Cal at one end, serving himself first and then his father, and then setting a bowl at the empty chair beside him without being asked, which told her something important about who usually sat there. Maggie appeared last. She was small for 7, with her mother's coloring apparently, lighter than the rest, pale-haired, and careful moving, the way certain children get when they've learned that stillness is a form of safety. She sat down beside Cal and looked at her bowl and ate without looking at Elena at all. "Maggie," Gideon said once, with a quality in his voice that was trying to be gentle and not quite managing. Maggie didn't look up. Cal looked at Elena with those direct hostile eyes and said, "How long are you staying?" "I don't know yet," Elena said. "That's not an answer. It's the honest one." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at his food. She couldn't tell if that was approval or just the absence of further argument. After dinner, she helped carry the dishes to the basin without being asked. Cal noticed. She saw him notice. But he didn't say anything. Gideon disappeared to the barn to check on a cow that had been limping, which she gathered from context was a nightly ritual. Maggie drifted to the front room and sat on the floor near the cold fireplace with a rag doll that had seen better years. Elena washed the dishes. Cal watched her from across the room. "You're going to try to stay," he said. "Not a question." "I'm going to try," she agreed. "It won't work." She dried a bowl and set it on the shelf. "Maybe not." "My dad doesn't need anyone." "Your dad's got a broken porch railing and a kitchen garden that's dead and accounts on his desk that look like they haven't been touched in 2 months, Elena said, without heat. "He might not want anyone. That's different from needing." Cal said nothing. She could feel him thinking. I'm not trying to replace your mother, she said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She kept her hands in the wash water. I'm not going to pretend I knew her or that I could be what she was. I'm just someone who needs a place and who's willing to work for it. A long silence. Her name was Ruth, Cal said finally, very quietly. Elena looked at him then. I know, she said. Your father mentioned her. He nodded once, tight and controlled, the way boys nod when they're holding something down. He picked up the last of the dishes from the table and brought them to the basin without being asked, set them in the water next to her hands, and then walked out of the kitchen. She stood there with her hands in the cooling wash water and let out a slow breath. Gideon said yes the next morning. He said it over coffee before Cal and Maggie were up, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the gray early light over the creek. He didn't look at her when he said it. He said, the arrangement would be practical. I need someone to manage the house and help with the children. You'd have a room, food, and I'd pay you a fair wage in addition until he stopped, until things are more settled. And the other part of the arrangement, Elena said. He did look at her then. Hale's contract specifies marriage, he said. It does. That doesn't have to mean anything beyond the legal form of it, he said. Not right away. We don't know each other. No, she said. We don't. He nodded. So, practical. Practical, she agreed. They were married 4 days later by the circuit judge who came through Caldwell Crossing on his monthly rounds. A brief, businesslike ceremony in the judge's temporary office above the grain storage building, with Ned Purvis as witness because he'd happened to be in town making deliveries. Cal stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Maggie held her rag doll and looked at the floor. It was not what Elena had imagined once, a long time ago, when she'd imagined such things, but she'd stopped imagining things like that sometime in the last 7 weeks. What she felt walking out of that office with Gideon Holloway's name now appended to hers was not joy and not grief. It was something more like the feeling of stepping off a ledge and discovering the ground is where you expected it to be. Not relief exactly, just solid. Plus, the work started the same afternoon they returned to the ranch. She began with the kitchen garden because it was what she could see from the kitchen window and because it bothered her every time she looked at it. It took 3 full days to clear the dead growth, turn the soil, and assess what could still be salvaged. Some herbs had survived at the root level. 2 rows of beets were coming back despite being neglected. The rest needed to be replanted from seed. She found seeds in the pantry, some still viable, some not. She made a list of what she needed from town. She did the accounts next, because the ranch accounts were what kept her awake at night, and not just metaphorically. She'd gone through the papers on Gideon's desk on the 3rd evening, not because he'd asked her to, but because the disorder of them was visible from the doorway, and she couldn't keep walking past it. What she found was a situation that was not yet catastrophic, but was moving in that direction with the particular slow momentum of something that nobody had stopped to look at directly. Gideon had credited the general store and the feed merchant both. He had 1 outstanding land payment, 3 years left on it, and 2 equipment debts, both at interest rates that were higher than they should have been. His cattle operation was sound in principle, but he'd been selling at whatever price the buyers offered because he didn't have the time or the bandwidth to negotiate. And she could see from the records that the prices he'd accepted in the past year were consistently below what the same buyers had paid others for comparable stock. She brought this to him on a Thursday evening after dinner, laying the papers out on the kitchen table in a specific order. He sat across from her and looked at what she'd put in front of him and said nothing for a moment. I know it's a mess, he said. It's not a mess, she said. It's fixable. But you need to stop selling to Garrett. Garrett's the buyer who comes out here. Garrett's the buyer who comes out here because you'll accept what he offers without argument. There are 2 other buyers in the region. One of them paid 12 cents more per head last spring than Garrett paid you for the same grade of cattle. She pointed to the figure on the paper. That's 12 cents across 300 head, over 2 seasons. He looked at the numbers. She could see him doing the arithmetic. I didn't know that. You do now. He sat back. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, a habit she was starting to recognize, that gesture, which meant he was processing something he didn't love but was going to accept. You got that from the records? And from asking at the feed store in town, she said. Delbert keeps track. He'll tell you if you ask. I've never asked. I know. A silence. What about the equipment debts? He said. The interest on the Harlan note is usurious, she said. I'd like to write to a bank in Dodge City about refinancing it. The rate they advertise for equipment loans is half what you're paying Harlan. He looked at her. You know about banking rates. I kept accounts for a dress shop in Baltimore for 3 years, she said. The owner's widow refinanced the building twice. I sat in on both negotiations. She paused. I'm not an expert, but I know enough to know you're being charged more than you should be. He was quiet for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then he said, Do what you think is right. I'll need your signature on the letter. You'll have it. She gathered the papers back into their order and was standing to take them back to the desk when he said, without particular inflection, Elena. She stopped. Thank you, he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table, but it sounded like he meant it. She said, It's what I'm here for, and took the papers and went. Cal was the harder problem. He wasn't openly cruel. She'd half expected that, from the look of him that first night, that direct hostility. But what he was instead was simply absent whenever she was present. He had a gift for removing himself from any room she entered, for having tasks that needed doing in the barn when she was in the house, for eating quickly and leaving the table before conversation could develop. He was not rude to her. He was nothing to her, which was its own particular kind of message. She didn't push. She let it alone and kept doing her work and waited. The first break came 3 weeks in, and it came sideways, the way things often do. She'd been splitting wood, not because it was strictly her job, but because the woodpile was low and nobody else had gotten to it, and she'd found an axe in the tool shed and knew how to use one, more or less, having grown up with practical parents who didn't assign tasks by gender. She was not good at it particularly. She was decent. She got it done. Cal came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her. She kept going. After a moment, she heard him pick up the second axe from where it leaned against the shed and start on the other end of the pile. They worked in silence for maybe 20 minutes. When the pile was done, she stacked her share and he stacked his, and they looked at the result. You hold the axe wrong, he said. I know. It works anyway. It'll tire you out faster. I don't mind tired. He looked at her. She looked back. It wasn't a confrontational look, just level. After a moment, he said, Here, and showed her the grip adjustment, standing beside her and demonstrating with his own axe. She adjusted her grip, tried it on the end of a log. It was, in fact, better. Thanks, she said. He shrugged and walked back to the barn. But the next day, he left a cup of coffee on the kitchen table for her before he went out to the morning chores without a word. She found it there cooling, next to a spoon, which was as clear communication as anything he'd said in 3 weeks. Maggie was different, quieter, more careful, and in some ways more watchful. She didn't engage the way Cal did, even in hostility. She simply moved around Elena like water around a stone, present, proximate, but not touching. Elena had been warned. She was patient. She found that Maggie had a habit of sitting on the bottom step of the back porch in the late afternoon, looking out at the creek with her rag doll in her lap. Elena began sitting on the step above her around the same time each afternoon. She didn't try to talk. She just sat there and did whatever needed doing with her hands, mending, shelling dried beans, working through the household accounts in a small notebook. Just present. It went on for a week like this before Maggie spoke. She said without turning around, Mama used to sit out here. Elena kept her hands moving. What did she do out here? Just sat, Maggie said. She watched the creek. It's a good creek to watch, Elena said. Maggie didn't say anything else. But she didn't move away either. They sat there until the light changed and Gideon called from inside that supper was close to ready. A week after that, Elena came out to the back step and Maggie was already there. She moved over without being asked, making room on the step above her. Elena sat down. She was working on a piece of harness leather that had cracked and needed conditioning. Not a task she'd done before, but she'd read about it and found the oil in the tool shed and was figuring it out by trial and error. Maggie watched her hands for a while. You're doing it wrong, Maggie said. Elena looked at her. How should I do it? Maggie reached over and repositioned Elena's grip on the cloth, the way a small person does when they know a thing and don't have words for the knowing. "Papa does it like this," she said. "Like this?" "More." Maggie put her hand over Elena's and pushed. "Better?" Elena said. "Better," Maggie said. She withdrew her hand and looked at the creek. Elena kept working. Neither of them said anything about the fact that it was the first time Maggie had touched her. The house changed slowly. Not dramatically. There was no single morning when everything was suddenly different. It happened the way most real change happens, which is incrementally and without announcement. The kitchen curtain stayed on its rod. The dishes were washed the same night they were dirtied. The kitchen garden came back by the 5th week. Not fully, not lush, but green and producing, the beets coming up strong and the herbs filling in along the border. Elena moved the desk papers into a proper ledger system, labeled and dated with a column for outgoing payments and one for income and one for the equipment debt balances, which she updated each month. She wrote the letter to the bank in Dodge City, and Gideon signed it, and the response came back in 2 weeks with a rate that was, as she'd predicted, substantially better than what he was paying Harlan. He didn't make a big moment of it. He read the letter, set it on the table, looked at her, and said, "Good." "There's still the Garrett problem," she said. "I wrote to the other buyer," he said. "The one in your notes, Crane. He's coming out next month." She hadn't known he'd done that. She felt something that wasn't quite surprise. She'd begun to understand that Gideon Holloway was a man who processed things quietly and acted on them in his own time, without ceremony. "That's good," she said. "You going to be here for that?" he said. She looked at him. It was the first time either of them had mentioned the conditional nature of the arrangement since they'd formalized it. Both of them had been operating on a kind of tacit agreement not to examine it too directly, to just move forward and see what held. "I'm here," she said. He nodded once. He picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his coat pocket and went out. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed. Through the window she could see the kitchen garden, properly green now. She could hear Cal out behind the barn doing something productive with fence posts, and she could hear Maggie upstairs moving around in her room with the particular rhythm of a child who has started doing something new up there. She had discovered 2 days ago that Maggie had started talking again. Not to her, not yet, but she'd heard her upstairs, a small voice carrying on a conversation with her doll, full sentences, detailed, the doll clearly playing the role of a series of different characters. Elena had stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened for 1 full minute and then walked quietly away without going up. She had not told Gideon yet. It wasn't her thing to tell, she'd decided. It was Maggie's. But standing in the kitchen looking at the green garden, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Something tentative and warm and fragile that she didn't have a name for precisely. Not happiness, not yet. Too early for that, and she'd learned to be suspicious of easy feelings. But something. Something like the first green thing coming up after a long winter. Not the full spring, just the signal that it was possible. She turned back to the stove. There was dinner to start. 1. The town's opinion of her changed more slowly than anything else. She was aware of it when she went in for supplies. The way certain women looked at her now, recalibrated, as though revising something they'd already concluded. She didn't go out of her way to court the change. She did her business and came back to the ranch and let the evidence speak for itself, which was all she could do. Ned Purvis, who ran into her outside the feed store about 6 weeks after she'd moved to the ranch, stopped and looked her over with his usual unhurried assessment and said, "You're still here." "Still here," she agreed. "Heard Holloway settled his Harlan debt." "He did?" "Heard his garden's back." "Coming along?" He squinted at her. "How are the children?" She thought about how to answer that. "Getting there," she said. He's getting there. Maggie is talking again." Something shifted in Ned Purvis's old face, just briefly. "Ruth would be glad of that," he said. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. He nodded once and went on his way. She stood outside this feed store for a moment in the August heat and thought about Ruth Holloway, whom she had never met and never would, who had sat on the back porch step and watched the creek, whose children carried her in the way that people carry grief, not visibly, mostly, but in the specific angles of their movements, in the things they did without thinking, in the silences they kept. She thought about what it meant to come into a life that had belonged to someone else. She'd thought about it before, in the abstract, on the way out here. But living it was different from thinking it. The house still had Ruth in it, not as a haunting, but as an architecture, the way certain people shape the spaces they've lived in and leave the shape behind. The placement of the hooks by the door, the specific fold of the kitchen curtains, the way Maggie held her doll, one-armed, which was probably the way Ruth had held her. Elena was not trying to remove any of that. She didn't want to. What she was doing, she thought, imperfectly and with more stumbling than she'd expected, was add something, to build a second layer over the existing one without erasing it. Whether that was possible in the long run, she didn't know. But she was here. She was still moving. She picked up her supply order from the feed store and loaded it into the wagon she'd borrowed for the day and drove back out to the ranch, 12 miles along the Carpenter Creek Road, watching the Kansas plains spread out around her in the afternoon light, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. When she came over the last rise and the ranch came into view below her, the house, the barn, the kitchen garden, green in the late light, smoke coming from the chimney because Cal had apparently started dinner without being asked, she felt the thing again. That nameless, tentative something. She let herself feel it this time without talking herself out of it. She drove the wagon down the slope toward home. The fever came in October, which was earlier than anyone expected. It started the way these things always start in valley communities, with a rumor, then a name, then a second name, then enough names that the rumor became a pattern, and the pattern became a fact that people spoke about in lowered voices outside the general store. The Deller children on the east side of the creek, then old Harmon Bess, who was already weak from a bad summer. Then two of the Vargas family's ranch hands. Elena heard about it on a Wednesday when she drove in for supplies. The woman at the general store, Mrs. Corrigan, who had thawed toward her incrementally over the past 2 months, said it with the particular careful tone people use when they are trying to convey the seriousness of something without causing panic in a public space. "It's the same kind that went through last winter," Mrs. Corrigan said. "The one that—" She stopped, looked at Elena. She didn't finish the sentence because she didn't need to. The one that took Ruth Holloway was what she didn't say, and Elena heard it anyway. She drove back to the ranch faster than usual. She didn't say anything to Gideon that evening, not because she was hiding it, but because she needed to think first, to take stock of what she knew and what she had on hand and what could be done practically. She'd grown up with a mother who had some nursing knowledge, not formal, just accumulated, the kind of knowledge that comes from being the person in a rural community that people call when someone is sick and the doctor is 40 miles away. Her mother had taught her what she knew, the way practical women teach practical daughters, not in lessons, just in the doing of things. Elena beside her, watching and helping, and eventually doing it herself. She went through the pantry that night after everyone was in bed. She made a list by lamplight of what she had. Willow bark, which was good for fever. A small store of dried elderflower, chamomile. A bottle of liniment of questionable age. Carbolic soap, which Mrs. Corrigan had started stocking after a physician had come through town 2 years prior and given a talk about cleanliness and disease that half the town had dismissed and half had quietly acted on. It wasn't much, but it was something. She wrote a second list of what she'd need if things got worse. Maggie started coughing on a Friday. It was a small cough at first, the kind children get from dry autumn air, the kind you notice but don't immediately worry about. Elena noticed it at breakfast and watched Maggie without saying anything and watched her again at dinner, and by that evening she knew it wasn't just dry air. The child had a warmth in her cheeks that wasn't from the fire, and her eyes had the slightly glassy quality that precedes a real fever by a few hours. She told Gideon after the children went to bed. She said it plainly, without softening it, because she'd found that he handled direct information better than handled information. He went very still. She watched it happen, watched the color shift in his face, watched something close off behind his eyes. It was not a natural stillness. It was the stillness of a man applying force to keep himself from reacting. "How bad?" he said. "Early," she said. "I don't know yet how bad, but I want to start treatment now before it progresses." "Ruth," he said, and then stopped. "I know," Elena said. Ruth started the same way. His voice was flat, not emotionless. The opposite, so much compressed into the flatness that she could feel the weight of it. Small cough, warm cheeks. I thought it was just... He stopped again. Gideon. She said his name the way she'd say a doorstop. Something to interrupt a slide. He looked at her. It's not the same situation yet. It might not become the same situation. I need you to help me manage it, not... I need you here. A long silence. He looked at his hands on the kitchen table. Tell me what you need, he said. I need you to ride to town tomorrow for the items on this list. She pushed the paper across the table. And I need you to not disappear on me. He looked at the list. He looked at her. I'm not disappearing. You were about to, she said. Not accusing, just true. He held her gaze for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable for both of them, and then he looked back at the list and said, I'll go at first light. Maggie's fever spiked on Saturday night. Elena had moved a pallet into Maggie's room that afternoon, reading the progression clearly enough to know she'd be sleeping there. She sat beside the child's bed through the evening while Gideon hovered in the doorway, and Cal sat at the top of the stairs and pretended he wasn't listening. Around 10 o'clock, Maggie's temperature went high enough that her skin felt dry when Elena pressed the back of her hand to the child's forehead. She soaked a cloth in cool water and laid it across Maggie's forehead and started the willow bark tea, working quietly by lamplight. And when Gideon appeared in the doorway again, she said without turning, Go sleep. I'll wake you if it changes. I'm not going to sleep, he said. Then sit somewhere you're not in my way. He made a sound that it was either irritation or something else and disappeared. She heard him on the stairs, then below, and then the sound of him pacing in the kitchen, which was distracting but manageable. Maggie woke around midnight, disoriented and frightened in the way of feverish children who surface from sleep into a world that doesn't quite make sense. She looked at Elena beside her, and for a moment her eyes searched the room for something else, someone else. And then, when she didn't find it, her face did something that was too old for a 7-year-old, a settling, an acceptance. Where's Papa? She said. Her voice was hoarse. Downstairs. Do you want him? A small pause. No, Maggie said. He gets scared. Elena looked at her. He does, she said. But he's here. Mama got scared too, Maggie said. She didn't want us to see. Elena kept her hands moving, refreshing the cloth, feeling for fever, keeping her face steady. Your mama sounds like she was trying to take care of you even when she was the sick one, she said. Maggie thought about this. She was, she said, with the simple certainty of a child reporting a known fact. She was always doing that. Try to sleep, Elena said. I'll be right here. Maggie looked at her. Her eyes were fever-bright and exhausted. You're not going to leave, are you? She said. Not a question, more like something she was checking on. No, Elena said. Promise? Elena pressed the back of her hand to the child's cheek. Still too warm, but not climbing, not yet. I promise, she said. Maggie closed her eyes. Elena sat beside her in the lamplight and worked through the night. Gideon came up around 2 a.m. He came quietly, which surprised her. She'd half expected him to burst in. He stood at the door and looked at Maggie, sleeping, and then at Elena beside the bed. How is she? He said. Low voice. Holding, Elena said. Fever's high, but I've seen it stabilize in the last hour. I need to keep the cloth cold and get the tea into her when she wakes. He came into the room and pulled the chair from the corner and sat on the other side of the bed. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at his daughter's face, and his own face in the lamplight was something Elena didn't quite have words for. The particular way a person looks when they are terrified of losing something they've already almost lost once before. She talked to me tonight, Elena said quietly. More than she usually does. He looked up. She's in there, Elena said. She's more there than she lets on. He was quiet for a moment. He reached out and touched Maggie's hair, very lightly, with the backs of his fingers. I know, he said. I think she started talking again a few weeks ago. I heard her upstairs. He paused. I didn't want to make a thing of it. Felt like if I mentioned it, she'd stop. She said you get scared. Elena said. He went still. Then, after a moment, did she? She wasn't criticizing, Elena said. I think she was looking out for you. He looked at his daughter's sleeping face and said nothing for a while. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. She's so much like Ruth, the way she watches people, the way she thinks. Elena didn't say anything. Sometimes there wasn't anything to say. They sat on opposite sides of the bed in the lamplight and let the silence do what it needed to do. Bum. The fever broke on Sunday evening. It didn't break dramatically. There was no clear single moment. It was more that Elena kept checking through the day, and at some point around 5 o'clock, she pressed her hand to Maggie's forehead, and the temperature under her palm was cooler than it had been, perceptibly, finally. She checked again an hour later, cooler still. She allowed herself one moment, sitting there alone with the child asleep and the evening light coming through the window, to close her eyes and breathe. Then she went downstairs and found Gideon in the kitchen. Cal was there too, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee he probably wasn't old enough for, pretending to be looking at something through the window. They both looked at her when she came in. "Fever's breaking," she said. Cal's jaw moved. He turned back to the window quickly. Gideon put his hand on the table surface, flat, and held it there. He looked at her, and something moved across his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the cautious, controlled expression she'd gotten used to, not the closed-off look he got when he was managing something difficult. Something more open than that, more unguarded. "She needs fluids and rest for the next several days," Elena said, because she needed to keep moving, to keep the practical things in the foreground. "And we should watch for any return of the fever in the first 48 hours. It can come back." "All right," Gideon said. His voice was rough. "I'll stay in her room until I'm sure she's past it." He nodded. She turned to go back upstairs. Behind her, she heard Cal say, quietly, not to her, to the window or to himself or maybe to his father, "She didn't leave. She didn't turn around. She kept walking, but she heard it." The town learned about Maggie's illness the way the town always learned things, through Ned Purvis, who heard it from a ranch hand who'd seen Gideon's lamp burning all night Saturday, and who spread the word in the specific way that Ned Purvis spread things, which was without embellishment and with a certain emphasis on the relevant facts. The relevant fact in this case, as Ned told it, was that Elena Holloway had sat up through 2 nights straight working on that child, and the child had pulled through. Mrs. Corrigan came out to the ranch on Tuesday with a pot of stew and a loaf of bread, the first time she'd ever come to the Holloway property, as far as Elena could tell from Gideon's expression when the wagon appeared in the yard. Elena thanked her and brought her inside and gave her coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes while Mrs. Corrigan asked after Maggie with the careful solicitude of a woman who has raised children and knows what a close call looks like. When she left, she said to Elena at the door, "There are people in town who said some things they shouldn't have when you first arrived." She looked at Elena directly. "I was one of them. I want you to know I'm aware of that." Elena looked at her. "I know you were," she said. "Well," Mrs. Corrigan adjusted the empty pot under her arm. "I'm aware of it." "Thank you for coming," Elena said, "and for the stew." Mrs. Corrigan nodded and went to her wagon. Elena watched her drive away and then went back inside. Cal was in the kitchen, having heard most of the exchange from the hallway. He looked at Elena with a new quality in his gaze, something that had been shifting since Sunday, something she couldn't quite define. The hostility was still there, but underneath it, or alongside it, was something else, something that was working itself out. "People said things about you," he said, "when you first came." "Yes." "What kind of things?" She considered the question. She set about washing the coffee cups. "Unkind things," she said, "about being unwanted, about the 3 men who didn't take me." He was quiet for a moment. "That wasn't your fault." "No," she said, "it wasn't." Prewitt was already married, Cal said, with the precision of someone who has looked into something. And Calloway's mother, people talk about her in town. She runs him. "That's true." "And Webb just ran off," he said. "He did." Another silence. Cal leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. His father's gesture, exactly. She'd noticed it before, and looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "Why did you come here?" he said. "Specifically here." You could have gone somewhere else. Tried another town. She looked at him. It was a fair question, and he was old enough for a fair answer. I was running out of time and out of options, she said. And what I heard about your father's situation sounded like something I could be useful to. I didn't know if he'd say yes, but I thought it was worth asking. Just useful, he said. A slight edge to it. Not hostile, more testing. At the start, she said honestly, that's all I was thinking about at the start. I needed a place. You needed someone. It seemed like an arrangement that could work. And now, he said. She turned back to the cups. Now I live here, she said. This is my home, whatever that means. He was quiet. She could feel him thinking, the way she'd learned to feel his silences, which had more content in them than most people's words. She asked for you, he said finally. Maggie. When the fever was really bad and she was out of it, she was calling for you. Elena's hand stilled in the water. I don't know if you knew that, Cal said. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. The sound of a boy saying something he'd decided to say even though it cost him something. She was calling for you, not for... He stopped. Just you. Elena stood at the basin with her hands in the cooling water and looked at the window and the kitchen garden beyond it, the beat still going strong in the October cold. Thank you for telling me, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I thought you should know, he said, and left the kitchen. Gideon found her on the back porch step that evening, Maggie's step, the one Maggie had first claimed and then shared with her, and that had somehow become the place Elena went when she needed to think. He came out the back door and stopped when he saw her there and then sat down on the step beside her without asking, which was new. He'd never sat beside her without some practical purpose attached to it. They looked at the creek. The evening was cold and clear, and the cottonwoods along the water had gone yellow and were dropping leaves in the light wind. Cal talked to you today, Gideon said. He did. He told me he was going to. He paused. He came and told me first what he was going to say. She looked at him, the side of his face in the evening light. He said... Gideon stopped. He seemed to be having some difficulty with what he was trying to say, which was unusual for him. He was not generally a man who struggled for words. He was a man who used few words and used them accurately. This was different. He said you didn't leave, that you stayed up 2 nights, and you didn't leave. Of course I didn't leave, Elena said. Not everyone would have, he said. I want you to know I'm... He stopped again. I know what it cost you. Those 2 nights. I know it wasn't nothing. No, she said. It wasn't nothing. Silence. The creek moved. A bird crossed the far bank in a low sweep and disappeared into the cottonwoods. I wasn't present, he said, when Ruth was sick. I was there, but I wasn't. I froze. I didn't know what to do, and I froze, and she... He cut himself off. His jaw was tight. That's not something I've talked about. You don't have to talk about it now, Elena said. I know, I want to. She waited. I was afraid, he said. I'd never seen anything I couldn't work at, something physical, something practical. You can always do something, but watching her get worse and not being able to... He pressed his lips together. I sat beside her and held her hand, and I thought that was enough. I thought being there was the same as doing something. He was quiet. It's not the same thing. Elena looked at the creek. You were doing what you knew how to do, she said. It wasn't enough. No, she said, because he didn't need softening. It wasn't. But this was different. You came up at 2 a.m, and you sat with her, and you stayed. Because you told me to, he said. No, I told you to sleep. You came up anyway. He looked at her. She looked back. And there it was. The thing that had been building in the margins of their arrangement for 2 months, the thing that neither of them had named because naming it would have required examining it, and examining it would have required something from both of them that neither of them had been sure they had. Elena, he said. Don't, she said gently. Not yet. Maggie's still recovering, and you're exhausted, and so am I. He held her gaze. That's not a no. It's a not yet, she said. He nodded. He looked back at the creek. After a moment, he said, "Fair enough." And the way he said it told her he meant it. They sat on the back porch step in the October evening and watched the creek and the yellow cottonwoods, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence she'd had with him since she'd arrived. Maggie came downstairs for dinner on Wednesday for the first time since the fever, wrapped in a quilt her grandmother had made and wearing the serious expression of someone who knows they've been the subject of a great deal of concern and is mildly embarrassed about it. She sat in her chair and looked at her soup and looked at Cal and then looked at Elena. "Did you really stay up 2 whole nights?" she said. "I slept a little," Elena said. "Cal said you didn't sleep." "Cal exaggerates." Cal looked up from his food with an expression that suggested he did not in fact exaggerate, but he let it go. Maggie ate a spoonful of soup. She seemed to be considering something. Then she said, "Thank you." "You're welcome," Elena said. "I think—" Maggie started and then seemed to lose her nerve and looked at her soup, and then looked back up with that particular Holloway resolve that Elena had learned to recognize in all 3 of them. "I think I'd like it if you stayed," she said. "Not just for now, I mean for—" She seemed to run out of words. "Just stayed," she finished. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Gideon looked at his plate. Cal looked at the window. Elena looked at Maggie's small, serious face across the table. "I'm staying," Elena said. "That's already decided." Maggie nodded as though this confirmed something she'd suspected, but needed confirmed. She turned back to her soup. Cal said to no one in particular, "The soup's good." It was the first time he'd said anything was good. Gideon looked at Elena across the table and didn't say anything, but what was in his eyes in that moment said enough. She held his gaze for a second and then looked down at her own bowl and felt the warmth of it. That ordinary kitchen light, those ordinary sounds of spoons against bowls and a child eating soup wrapped in a quilt. Settle into her chest and stay there. It wasn't everything, but it was real. And real was what she'd come here for. November came in hard that year, earlier than the old-timers expected, with a cold that settled into the valley like it intended to stay. The creek froze at the edges by mid-month, and the cattle had to be moved to the lower pasture where the grass held a little longer under the snow. Gideon and Cal worked the move over 2 days, coming in at night with red hands and the particular exhaustion of men who have been outside in cold wind for 10 hours. And Elena had food on the table both evenings before they came through the door, which was not a small thing, and all 3 of them knew it without saying so. Maggie was fully recovered by the 2nd week of November. She came back to life the way certain quiet children do, not with noise or visible excitement, but with a gradual return of presence, a filling in of the space she occupied. She started talking at the dinner table again. Small things. Something she'd seen from the window, a question about the cattle, an observation about the way the frost formed on the inside of her bedroom glass in the mornings. She started following Elena through the kitchen in the afternoons the way she'd done before the illness, asking questions about whatever Elena had her hands on, learning the way Maggie learned things, by watching first, asking precisely, then trying it herself with the stubborn concentration of someone who doesn't like to be bad at anything. It was Maggie who first noticed the problem with the east fence line. She'd been sitting on the fence rail watching Cal and Gideon bring the last of the cattle down, and she came in that evening and told Elena at the kitchen counter, in a matter-of-fact tone, that some of the fence posts on the east boundary looked like they were leaning the wrong way. Elena told Gideon at dinner. He set down his fork. "How many posts?" She said a stretch of them, toward the creek side. He looked at Cal. Cal said, "I saw it too. Didn't think it was that bad." "It's bad enough that she noticed it from the rail," Elena said. Gideon pushed back from the table. "I'll look at it tomorrow." "The ground's going to freeze solid in another week," Elena said. "If the posts need to be reset, you need to do it before that." "I know when the ground freezes," he said, slightly sharp. "I know you do," she said evenly. "I'm just saying tomorrow might be cutting it close." A short silence. Cal looked between them. Maggie ate her food with great concentration. "Day after tomorrow," Gideon said. "That works," Elena said, and went back to her meal. It was a small exchange, but it was different from the exchanges they'd been having 2 months ago, when she'd been careful about how she presented information to him, choosing her angles, watching for resistance. She wasn't careless now. She still paid attention, But she wasn't managing him anymore either. She was talking to him. There was a difference, and she'd noticed the shift happening somewhere in the weeks after Maggie's fever, and she thought he'd noticed it too. The fence posts were reset on Thursday. Cal worked alongside his father, and Elena brought them both coffee mid-morning and stood watching for a few minutes while they dug out the posts and tamped in gravel and reset them straight. When she handed Cal his cup, he said thank you without being prompted, which was still new enough that she registered it. These would have been down by spring, Gideon said when she handed him his. He was looking at the fence line, not at her. I know. Maggie's better at looking at things than I give her credit for, he said. She's very good at looking at things, Elena said. She gets it from someone. He looked at her then. A short look, but direct. He took a drink of his coffee. How are we on the winter supplies? He said. Good. Better than last year, if your records are accurate. She'd gone through the previous winter's consumption in the ledger, estimating forward. We're a little short on lamp oil. I'd order more before the roads get bad. I'll get it when I go in for the salt. Next week? If the weather holds. I'll write you a list. He made the sound that meant acknowledged and went back to the fence post. She picked up the empty cups and walked back to the house. She wrote to her brother Henry in December. She hadn't written to him since she'd left Baltimore. She'd sent one brief note from a rail stop in Missouri saying she'd arrived safely somewhere, which was barely true at the time, and nothing since. Henry had his own life, and it didn't have much room in it for her troubles, and she'd known that going in. But enough time had passed and enough had changed that she felt she could write something honest without it being a burden. She wrote it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning while Gideon was out checking on the cattle and the children were still asleep. She told him about the ranch, about the work, about Gideon and Cal and Maggie. She told him about the fever and what it had taken to get through it. She told him she had a home now, a real one, and that it hadn't come about the way she'd expected anything to come about, but that she was learning that was sometimes how the best things arrived, sideways, when you weren't looking for them in the right direction. She sealed the letter and set it on the corner of the desk to go out with the next mail run. Gideon came in while she was still at the desk and looked at the letter. Henry, he said, reading the address. My brother, she said. You haven't written him before. I didn't have anything good to say before, she said. It seemed better to wait. He looked at her. He hung his coat on the hook and came and sat across the table from her. Not at the far end as he used to, but closer now, the comfortable distance of people who have stopped being careful about distance. And now you have something good to say, he said. I do. He looked at the letter. What did you tell him? That I have a home, she said. That I'm well. That the work suits me. A pause. That's all? That's the important part. He was quiet for a moment. He had the expression she'd come to know as him thinking something he wasn't sure whether to say. She waited. The crane buyer is coming back in February, he said. I got a letter from him. He wants to discuss a longer contract, more head, set price across the season. That's good, she said. That's what you want, price certainty. I want you to be in the room when we talk, he said. She looked at him. You don't need me in the room. I know I don't need you, he said. I want you there. Crane's going to try to lowball the per head price in exchange for the volume. I want someone next to me who's going to notice if the numbers don't add up before I agree to anything. You can do that arithmetic yourself. I know I can. He met her eyes steadily. But I think better when you're there. That's the honest reason. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. I'll be there. He nodded once. He picked up his coffee cup and stood to go back to the kitchen. At the doorway he paused and said, without turning around, You should tell him more than that. Your brother. He should know you're happy. He went through to the kitchen before she could respond. She sat at the desk and looked at the sealed letter for a moment. Then she picked it up, broke the seal, and wrote one more paragraph. The crane meeting happened on a Thursday in February in the front room of the Caldwell Crossing Land Office, which was the largest private room in town and where business of any real consequence tended to get conducted. Crane was a compact, well-dressed man from Wichita with the manner of someone who spent a great deal of his professional life making people feel they were getting a good deal when they weren't. He opened with volume figures and moved quickly to the per-head price, which was, as Gideon had predicted, below market. Elena was sitting slightly to Gideon's left. She didn't say anything. She had a small notebook and she made a note in it. Crane glanced at her. "Mrs. Holloway keeps your accounts," he said to Gideon. "She keeps our accounts," Gideon said. Crane smiled in the way of men who have a specific attitude about women doing accounts and are pretending they don't. "Well then," he said and turned back to Gideon. "As I was saying, the volume commitment justifies the adjusted rate. The adjusted rate you're offering is 11 cents below what you paid Alderman's spread last spring for the same grade," Elena said. She kept her voice pleasantly level. Their volume was comparable to what we're discussing. Crane looked at her. "I'm not sure where you're getting those figures." "Delbert Sykes at the feed store keeps regional sale records," she said. "He's been doing it for 15 years. He'll confirm them if you'd like to ask him yourself." A brief silence. Crane looked at Gideon. Gideon said nothing. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at Crane with the patient expression of a man who is comfortable waiting. Crane looked back at Elena. The pleasant manner had shifted slightly. Not hostile, but recalibrated. "You're well informed," he said. "We try to be," she said. They got 12 cents above Crane's opening offer. It wasn't everything, but it was better than Gideon would have gotten alone, and both of them knew it on the ride back to the ranch. Gideon drove and didn't say anything for the first few miles. She sat beside him on the wagon bench with her hands in her lap and watched the winter fields go by. 12 cents, he said eventually. "You could have pushed for 14, she said. "Could I?" Crane wanted the volume. He would have come up more if you'd walked toward the door. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I'll remember that for next time." "I'll come with you next time too," she said. "If you want." He looked at her sideways. "You're going to become indispensable," he said. Not quite a complaint. Something else. "I already am," she said. He made a sound. The sound that in Gideon Holloway's limited vocabulary of sounds meant something close to laughter. She'd been learning to identify them. Ikit. It was Cal who brought up the garden in March. He came in from checking the south pasture on a morning in early March when the ground was starting to soften at the edges, the first genuine sign that winter was loosening its grip, and he stopped at the kitchen doorway where Elena was working through the seed inventory. "We should expand the kitchen garden," he said. "West side. There's good soil there." Elena looked up at him. He'd grown in the winter, not dramatically, but visibly. His voice had changed too, dropping registers in the way of boys who aren't quite boys anymore. He stood in the doorway with mud on his boots and his arms crossed in that familiar posture and looked at her with eyes that had entirely lost their hostility and replaced it with something like the careful directness of a person deciding to be honest. "How big?" she said. "Twice what we've got. We could grow enough to sell at the Caldwell Crossing market in summer. Mrs. Corrigan said the market's been short on produce the last 2 years. "When did you talk to Mrs. Corrigan?" Elena said. "When you sent me for the lamp oil, she mentioned it." He shifted his weight. "I thought it was worth looking into." Elena looked at him for a moment. He had, she realized, been paying attention all along. Even in the months when he'd been hostile and absent, he'd been watching and thinking. He was his father's son in that respect, processing things quietly and acting on them in his own time. "It's a good idea," she said. I'd need help turning the ground. Cal can't do it alone and Papa's got the fence work on the north side," he said, using his own name in the third person the way people do when they're stating something they've already reasoned through. He caught himself. "I can't do it alone. I'd need someone." "I'll help," she said. He nodded. He started to leave. "Cal?" she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for thinking about it." He shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a 13-year-old who has done something he's slightly proud of but doesn't want to perform pride. "Just makes sense," he said, and went. She sat with the seed inventory in her hands and thought about that boy who'd looked at her the first night with pure, uncomplicated hostility, who'd told his father they didn't need anyone, who'd sat at the top of the stairs pretending not to listen while his sister burned with fever below. She thought about the cup of coffee left on the table without words. The axe grip correction. The phrase she didn't leave, said to no one in particular. Growth, she thought, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it was just there one morning, like the first soft ground after a long freeze. The garden expansion happened in late March and then April, and by May there were double the rows and a new bed of tomatoes on the west side that Cal had staked with careful precision and tended with the focused attention he gave to anything he'd decided to care about. Elena started keeping track of what was coming up and in what quantities and doing the arithmetic on what the summer market might bring. The numbers were promising. She brought them to Gideon on a May evening after dinner, spreading the notebook open on the table between them, the way she'd spread the accounts on that first October evening that felt like something from another life. He looked at the figures, then he looked at her. "This is real," he said. "It's real," she said. "It's conservative, too. I accounted for weather loss." He sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, a habit she'd come to recognize as him seeing the larger picture of something, arranging the pieces. "Between this and the crane contract and the refinanced equipment note," he said slowly, "we're solvent," she said, comfortably. He looked at her. "More than solvent." "More than solvent," she agreed. He was quiet. She could see him processing it, not just the numbers, but what the numbers meant. The accumulated weight of the past year, the distance traveled from where the ranch had been when she arrived to where it was now. "When I came here," he started. "You don't have to say anything about that," she said. "I want to." He looked at her directly. "When you came here, I thought I was doing you a favor, taking you in because you had nowhere else to go and I needed someone in this house." "That was true," she said. "It was true, and it was also wrong," he said. "I mean, the way I saw it was wrong. I thought I was the one doing the offering." He paused. He was choosing words carefully. "You came here with nothing, and you turned this place around, and you saved my daughter, and you—" He stopped. His jaw was tight with something he was managing. "I don't know how to say this without sounding like I'm stating what's obvious." "Then state what's obvious," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," he said. Simply, plainly, without decoration. "That's what's obvious. It's been obvious for a while. I didn't know how to say it, and I'm saying it now." She sat across the table from him in the May evening light, with the notebook between them and the sound of Cal outside somewhere, working, and Maggie's voice drifting down from upstairs talking to her doll, and she felt the whole year gather itself in her chest, the stage road, and the 3 rejections, and the sign nailed to Douglas Webb's post, and the walk back through the dust, and Ned Purvis, and the bruised shoulder, and the curtain on its rod, and the cold wash water, and the nights beside Maggie's bed. "I know," she said. "I can see it. Can you?" He looked at her steadily. "And what do you see when you look back?" She looked at him. This difficult, quiet, stubborn man with the grief in his eyes that was always there but further back than it used to be. This man who'd stood at a forge and looked at her without kindness and without hostility, and simply assessed what was in front of him and made a practical decision that had turned out to be the least practical thing either of them had ever done. "I see someone I want to stay with," she said. "Not because I have to, because I want to. That's different from where we started." "Very different," he said. "I'm not Ruth," she said, because she needed to say it plainly once. "No," he said. "You're not. I know who you are." "Good," she said. "I need you to know who I am." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, flat, the way he'd put his hand on the table the night Maggie's fever broke. The same gesture, but different. That time it had been about relief. This time it was about something else. Something that was choosing to be there, deliberately, without necessity. She turned her hand over under his and held it. They sat like that at the kitchen table with the notebook between them and the evening coming in through the window and the ranch around them. Green and alive and whole in a way it hadn't been when she arrived. By July, the kitchen garden was producing more than they could use, which was what she'd planned for. Cal took the first wagon load to the Caldwell Crossing summer market on a Saturday morning, with Elena riding alongside him and a tarp over the vegetables to keep the dust off. She let him handle the selling. He was good at it, precise about the weights, direct about the prices, not aggressive, but not soft either. By 11 o'clock, he'd sold out and was counting the coins in his palm with the particular satisfaction of someone who has tested a theory and found it holds. $22, he said. $23.50, she said. You gave Mrs. Alderman wrong change. He counted again. His mouth quirked. $23.50, he confirmed. Good, she said. Next time we bring twice as much. He put the coins in his coat pocket and looked out at the market around them. The other vendors, the townspeople moving between the stalls, the children running between adult legs in the July heat. People kept asking who the garden belonged to, he said. I told them Holloway Ranch. What did they say? He looked at her sideways with that Holloway directness that had stopped being confrontational somewhere in the fall and had become something else. Something that was almost affectionate, in the specific way of people who don't do affectionate easily and so show it in glances and small gestures and the precise words they choose to share. They said it figured, he said. They said it figured, given who was running the ranch now. She looked back at the market. Did they? Yes, he said. And then, after a moment, they meant you, in case that wasn't clear. I know what they meant, she said. He nodded. He climbed up onto the wagon and picked up the reins. She climbed up beside him. Cal, she said. Yeah. You did well today. He looked straight ahead down the Caldwell Crossing Main Street and said nothing. But the line of his shoulders shifted. Not much, just enough. She let it alone and let him drive them home. Summer turned to fall and the ranch turned with it. The crane contract delivered what it had promised, and then some. The garden had been replanted for a second harvest, and the market appearances became a regular Saturday event that Cal began preparing for on wet days with the precision that told Elena it had become, without fanfare, his project. Gideon repaired the porch railing in September, all of it, properly, with new lumber, and repainted the shutters, and Elena noticed him doing it from the kitchen window on a Saturday morning, and felt something she didn't try to name, just let it sit warmly in her chest. Maggie was talking more than she'd ever talked, as far as anyone could remember. She'd started drawing, not with any particular instruction, just producing dense, careful pictures of the creek and the cattle and the house and the people in the house, spreading them across the kitchen table and then rolling them up and putting them away in a box under her bed. One afternoon, Elena came upstairs and found a drawing on her own pillow, the back porch step, 2 figures sitting on it, rendered with the careful inaccuracy of a child who is still learning hands, but who gets the shapes of things right in some essential way. She put it in the box with her mother's letters. In October, a year after Maggie's fever, almost to the week, Gideon came in from the barn one evening and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table while Elena was finishing the dinner accounts. He sat there and waited until she looked up. What? She said. I want to do this properly, he said. The marriage. I want it to be what it is, not what we said it was at the start. She looked at him. It already is what it is, she said. I know. But I want to say it out loud. To you and to the children, that this is a real family, that he paused, that this is your home, not in the practical sense, in the actual sense. She looked at him for a long moment. Gideon, she said, I turned my hand over. He looked at her, not understanding. At the kitchen table, in May, when you put your hand on mine. She held his gaze. I turned my hand over. That was my answer. That was my yes. He was quiet. Then he said, I just wanted to be sure you knew mine. I knew yours, she said. I've known yours for a while. He reached across and put his hand over hers again. Same gesture, same table. She turned her hand over again, and this time he laced his fingers through hers and held on. From upstairs came the sound of Maggie's voice, carrying on her nightly conversation with the rag doll. From outside came the sound of Cal finishing the evening's last chores, boots on the porch steps. The lamp burned between them. The accounts could wait. The second winter was easier than the first. Not easy. Nothing about ranching in Kansas was easy, and Elena had long since stopped expecting ease as a baseline condition, but easier in the specific way that things become manageable once you understand them. She knew where the drafts came in through the kitchen wall and had packed them with cloth before October. She knew how many cords of wood they'd burned through February and had Cal stack accordingly. She knew that Gideon's hands cracked in the cold if he didn't use the lanolin she kept on the shelf by the door, and she knew he wouldn't remember to use it himself, so she stopped waiting for him to remember and just handed it to him in the evenings when he came in. He accepted this without comment, which was its own kind of language. Maggie grew 2 inches between September and March and outgrew every dress she owned. This was a crisis of significant proportions in Maggie's estimation and was treated accordingly. Elena spent 2 evenings letting out hems and taking in seams from fabric she'd bought at the Caldwell Crossing dry goods store, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close, and Maggie sat across from her and watched with the focused attention she brought to everything and asked questions about the stitching, not because she particularly wanted to sew, but because she wanted to understand the mechanics of the thing. "Why not just buy new ones?" Maggie said. "Because the fabric in these is good," Elena said, working the seam. "Waste the money buying new cloth when what you have is fixable." Maggie thought about this. "Is that something your mother taught you?" "Some of it," Elena said. "Some of it I taught myself." "What did your mother teach you?" Elena kept her hands moving. She thought about her mother, the specific image she always came back to. Her mother at a kitchen table, not unlike this one, doing exactly this kind of work, hands moving with the efficient certainty of someone who had done a thing so many times it had become as natural as breathing. "She taught me that most things can be managed if you don't panic," Elena said, "and that the ones that can't be managed have to be survived." Maggie was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Is that what you did when you came here?" she said. "Managed it?" "At the start," Elena said. "At the very start, I was just surviving it." She looked up at Maggie across the lamplight. "But that's all you need sometimes, just to survive it long enough." Maggie nodded as though this confirmed something she'd been thinking. She reached across the table and straightened the fabric Elena was working on, a small, practical gesture, helping without being asked. Elena let her hold it and worked the seam. Cal turned 14 in March. He asked for nothing for his birthday, which was his consistent position on birthdays, and which Elena had decided to override on the grounds that consistent positions sometimes need overriding. She baked a cake. Not a perfect cake. She was competent at bread and serviceable at most other things, but cake was not her strength, and the result was slightly lopsided and denser than ideal. Maggie decorated it with dried berries pressed into the frosting in a pattern that was clearly meant to be something but was difficult to identify from any angle. Cal looked at it when it came to the table. "What is that supposed to be?" he said to Maggie. "The ranch?" Maggie said, with complete confidence. "It doesn't look like the ranch." "It does from above." Gideon looked at the cake, then at Elena. She pressed her lips together. He pressed his. Cal ate 2 pieces and said nothing more about the decorations. After dinner, while Maggie helped Elena with the dishes, Cal came to stand beside his father at the front window where Gideon was looking out at the dark yard. "Papa," he said. "Yeah." A pause. "I want to learn the cattle business, not just the work, the buying and selling part, the negotiating." Gideon looked at his son. Cal looked back with the serious, direct gaze that had been his since infancy. "Why?" Gideon said. "Because I want to run something of my own someday," Cal said, "and I need to know how it works before I can do that." Gideon was quiet for a moment. From the kitchen came the sound of Elena and Maggie talking, water running, the domestic percussion of a household moving through its evening. He looked at his son and thought about a boy he'd been himself once, not so different, standing in front of his own father with the same specific desire to understand how things worked, so that he could eventually make them work differently. "Talk to Elena about the accounts first," he said. "She'll show you how we track the herd value month to month. Then we'll start taking you to the crane meetings." Cal nodded once. "All right." "And Cal," Gideon waited until the boy looked at him. "Good instinct, coming to me and saying it straight." Cal's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the thing adjacent to it in people who don't smile easily. He went to help stack the wood by the fireplace without being asked, which was, Elena had learned, his way of receiving a compliment. The letter came in April. It was from a woman named Dorothea Vance in a town called Harrow, 40 miles east of Caldwell Crossing. The letter was 3 pages long and had the careful, slightly formal handwriting of someone who was composing something important and was anxious to get it right. Dorothea Vance explained that she had heard Elena's story from a woman who had heard it from Ned Purvis, who had apparently been telling it to anyone who rode with him for the past year as a matter of some personal pride. Dorothea Vance said she was in a difficult situation. Her husband had died in August. She had a farm she couldn't manage alone. She had 2 young children. She had no money to return east, and she had been told that if she wanted advice from someone who understood what it meant to start from nothing on the frontier, Elena Holloway was the person to write to. Elena read the letter at the kitchen table twice. She showed it to Gideon that evening. He read it. He set it on the table. He looked at her. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Write back," she said. "What else would I do?" "She's asking for more than advice," he said. Not an objection, just a precise reading of the letter. "I know," Elena said. He looked at her steadily. "We've got the room," he said. She looked at him. "You sure?" "I said it," he said. "I'm sure." She wrote back the same night. She wrote 4 pages. Practical, specific, honest. She told Dorothea Vance what she knew about managing accounts on limited resources. She told her about the kitchen garden and the market. She told her about the specific documents to request when dealing with buyers, and the questions to ask about land debt interest rates, and the value of keeping clear records of every transaction, no matter how small. She told her that the frontier was hard on women who arrived expecting anything to be easy, and that the women who survived it were not necessarily the strongest or the smartest, but the ones who kept going after the first failure, and the second, and the third. She also told her that if she needed a place to come to while she sorted herself out, she could come to Holloway Ranch. She sealed the letter and put it with Cal's mail run. Gideon, reading over her shoulder the way he'd started doing without asking permission and without her minding, said nothing until she sealed it. Then, 4 pages. She needed 4 pages worth of things. "You told her she could come here. You said we had the room." "I did," he said. He straightened up. "I just want to be sure you know what you're starting." She looked at him. "What am I starting?" He was quiet for a moment. "Something," he said. "I don't know what to call it, but when you write letters like that to strangers, and they come, and they get back on their feet, and they go tell someone else, that turns into something." She'd thought about that. "Is that a problem?" He picked up his coffee cup. "No," he said. "I just want you to know I see it." She turned back to the desk. "Good," she said. "Then you can help me think of what to do with it." Okay. Dorothea Vance arrived in May, thin and worn, and with 2 children under 5 who sat on either side of her on the wagon seat and watched the world with the wide, quiet eyes of children who have been through something they don't have words for. Elena met her in the yard and helped her down and brought her inside and fed her before she asked her a single question about her situation, because she remembered what it was like to be hungry and tired and needing to be steady before you could think clearly. She stayed 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Elena sat with her at the kitchen table most evenings and went through her finances with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to Gideon's. She helped her write to the bank holding her land note. She helped her draft a letter to a cousin in Harrow who had been ambiguous about whether he'd help manage the farm through the coming season. The letter was direct and specific about what she needed and what she was offering in exchange, and the cousin wrote back within the week agreeing to terms. The morning Dorothea left, she stood in the yard with her children and looked at Elena with the expression of someone trying to find adequate words and not finding them. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," Elena said. "Why did you?" Elena looked at her. She thought about Ned Purvis sketching a map on a piece of paper for a woman he'd never met. She thought about Mrs. Corrigan on the doorstep with a pot of stew. She thought about small, quiet kindnesses that had accumulated around her like stones placed one at a time until they formed something you could stand on. "Because someone helped me get started," she said, "and it cost them almost nothing, and it meant everything." Dorothea nodded. Her oldest child tugged at her sleeve. She looked down and then back up. "I'll tell people about you," she said. "Tell them about the practical parts," Elena said. "The accounts and the market and the debt letters. Those are the parts that actually help." "I'll tell them all of it," Dorothea said. She drove away down the Carpenter Creek Road. Elena stood in the yard and watched her go, and when she turned around, Maggie was on the porch watching her. "Is she going to be all right?" Maggie said. "Yes," Elena said. "She's going to be all right." Maggie considered this. "How do you know?" "Because she came and asked for help," Elena said. "People who come and ask for help are usually going to be all right." Maggie looked at her with those watchful eyes that missed nothing. "Is that what you did when you came here?" Elena climbed the porch steps. She put her hand briefly on top of Maggie's head, a gesture that had developed somewhere in the past year, casual and warm, neither of them quite acknowledging when it had started. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what I did." 4 years passed, the way years pass when there is real work in them. Not quickly, not slowly, but fully, each season distinct, each one building something on the last. The kitchen garden became a proper market enterprise, with Cal managing the books on it with a fastidiousness that slightly exceeded even Elena's own standards, which she found both amusing and quietly satisfying. He started talking about acquiring land of his own at 16, not as a dream, but as a plan, with specific figures and a timeline, which he presented to Gideon on a Sunday evening with the organized precision of someone who had been watching Elena run financial meetings for 3 years and had absorbed the method. Gideon listened to the whole presentation and then said, "What do you need from me?" "Bitsums," and Cal said, "I need you to co-sign a letter of intent to the land office." And Gideon said, "All right," and that was that. Maggie turned 12 and informed the family at dinner that she intended to become a veterinarian, a word she'd encountered in a newspaper that had come from Wichita wrapped around something from the dry goods store. The family received this information with varying degrees of expressed surprise. Gideon asked what a veterinarian was exactly. Cal said he knew that already. Maggie explained in detail. Elena said, "Then we should find out who's doing that work in the region and get you in front of them so you can learn something real." And Maggie looked at her with those precise eyes and said, "I already thought of that. There's a man in Wichita. I wrote him a letter." Ashwambaki Baimgon. Gideon looked at Elena across the table. Elena looked back. "She wrote a letter," Gideon said. "She did," Elena said. "I wonder where she learned that," he said. "I have no idea," Elena said. They kept their faces straight for as long as they could, which was not very long. The letters kept coming. Not in great numbers, not all at once, but steadily. Women who had heard from Dorothea Vance, or from someone who had heard from someone else. Women in difficult situations who needed practical guidance more than they needed sympathy. Elena wrote back to every one of them. She answered the specific questions directly, and she told them what she knew, and she did not dress it up. Gideon read some of the letters. He read her responses sometimes too, when she left them on the desk. He never commented on the content directly, but she would sometimes come into the kitchen and find him refilling her coffee cup before she'd asked, or come to the desk and find the lamp already lit, which was his way of saying things without saying them, a language she had become fluent in. One evening he came and sat beside her while she was writing, not across the table, beside her, which was something new, and read the letter she was working on over her shoulder. It was to a woman in Abilene who was being pushed off her late husband's land by his brother and didn't know if she had any legal recourse. "She needs a lawyer," Gideon said, "not just a letter, not just a—" "I know," Elena said. "I'm telling her who to talk to in Dodge City, and I'm telling her what to say when she gets there. Do you know that?" "I know enough." She kept writing. "I know what questions to ask. I know what the land law says about surviving spouses. I know what language sounds like someone who knows their rights, and what language sounds like someone who can be pushed around." She paused. "She needs to sound like the first one." He was quiet. She could feel him reading as she wrote. After a moment, he said, "You should put the specific statute in there. The one about homestead rights. Delbert Sykes has a copy of the Kansas Land Code. I've seen it." She stopped. She looked at him. "You looked that up." "I looked it up," he said, with the same flat tone he used for everything, and then stood and went to get the rest of the coffee. She sat at the desk and looked at the letter and thought about that. About a man who had stood at a forge and assessed her the first time he saw her and made a cold, practical calculation that had turned out to be the most consequential decision either of them had made. About how much space there was between practical and tender, and how she'd learned that in the right person. Those two things were not opposites at all, but expressions of the same underlying instinct, to identify what was needed and supply it without ceremony. She finished the letter with the statute reference. She sealed it. She set it on the stack for the mail run. There was an evening in the summer of the 5th year, August again, August like when she'd arrived, the heat coming off the ground in waves. When she stood on the back porch in the cooling evening and looked out at the creek and the cottonwoods and the cattle moving through the far pasture and tried to find the thread back to the woman who had arrived in this place with $42 and a bruised shoulder and a suitcase in the dust, she could find her. She was still there somewhere, that woman. The exhaustion of that first day, the specific degradation of standing in a street while people laughed, the feeling in front of Douglas Webb's padlocked mill, those things didn't vanish. They settled. They became part of the architecture of a person, the way Ruth was part of the architecture of this house, the way her mother's voice was part of the architecture of her own hands. But standing here now in the evening light, she could also see clearly what those days had given her that nothing easier ever would have. The rejections that had felt like an ending had been, in fact, a narrowing, a forced passage through something tight and dark that had brought her out here, to this specific piece of ground, to this specific man, and these specific children, and this particular life that she would not have chosen from a menu of options but had grown into with the full weight of every hard thing she'd been through. That wasn't comfort you could offer a person in the middle of it. She'd learned that from the letters. You couldn't tell someone who was suffering that it would make sense later, because later is theoretical, and suffering is immediate, and the distance between them is enormous. What you could tell them was simpler and harder. Keep going. Not because it will definitely be fine, but because stopping is the only thing that guarantees it won't be. The screen door opened behind her. Gideon came out and stood beside her without touching her, the way he did, looking out at the same view. "Cal's got the number he needs," he said, "for the land down by the South Fork." "I know. I checked it this morning." "He's going to be all right," Gideon said, meaning he's going to make it work, meaning we raise someone who knows how to make things work. "Yes," she said, "he is." They stood together in the August evening and watched the cattle and the creek and the cottonwoods, which were just beginning to go pale at the tips, the first suggestion of the change that was coming. Behind them in the house, Maggie was doing something in the kitchen, the particular sound of a 12-year-old who has decided to cook something and is going about it with professional seriousness. From further back came the sound of Cal's voice, outside, talking to the horses in the low, even tone he used with animals, which was the same tone Elena had noticed he used now with younger kids in town, with Maggie when she was upset, with the world when it needed steadying. She thought about what Gideon had said once in April when she'd sent Dorothea Vance's letter. "I just want you to know I see it." She thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who was not easily impressed, not given to flattery, not interested in the performed version of things. A man who assessed what was in front of him and called it what it was. She thought that being seen by someone like that was worth more than all the easy admiration in the world. "I got another letter," she said, "from a woman outside of Wichita." "What does she need?" "Someone to tell her she's not finished," Elena said. "That's mostly what it is." He was quiet for a moment. "And are you going to tell her that?" "Yes," she said, "and then I'm going to tell her what to do next. Something specific and practical. Because that's what I would have wanted. Someone to say, here, try this, and then try this, and then try this." He nodded. He looked out at the creek. "Elena," he said. "Yeah. I'm glad you came here." He said it the way he said most important things, simply, without build-up, without flourish. Just the true thing, stated plainly. She turned and looked at the side of his face in the fading evening light. This man, this particular, difficult, decent man who had handed her a cup of coffee one morning before she'd been there a week and said nothing about it, who had sat on the other side of a child's sickbed through the darkest night she'd known in this place, who had laced his fingers through hers at a kitchen table and held on. "Me too," she said. She meant it without reservation, which was different from where she'd started. Where she'd started, everything had conditions. Every arrangement was provisional, every commitment contingent, every step forward made with one eye on the door in case it didn't work out. That was what surviving did to you. It made you careful, made you hedge, made you unwilling to fully put your weight down anywhere because you'd had the ground give way before. But you could not live in a place and work it and tend it and cry over it and be afraid for it without, eventually, without quite deciding to, putting your weight down. That was the thing she'd learned that she couldn't have learned any other way. You could plan a life, or you could live one. The living was the part that surprised you. The sun went down behind the low hills west of the creek. The sky went amber and then deep. The cattle settled. Maggie called from inside that dinner was ready, which was optimistic given what the kitchen had sounded like 20 minutes ago, but they went in anyway. The table was set. The food was imperfect and present. They sat down together and ate.